Story 1 to 269, Lost Souls of Flight 007. The voices started 3 days after we found the first body. I am a commercial diver, and in September 1983, I was part of the international recovery effort searching for wreckage from Korean Airlines Flight 007. You probably remember the headlines. A civilian airliner shot down by Soviet fighters after straying into restricted airspace. 269 people dead in the black waters off Sakhalin Island. What you done knows what we found down there. What we heard, what followed some of us home. My name is Jack, and for 30 years I've been kept quiet about what happened during those weeks in the North Pacific. But the voices are getting stronger, the dreams are getting worse, and I think it is time people understood that some tragedies leave marks that go deeper than grief or politics. The recovery operation was massive, involving ships and divers from multiple countries. The Soviets were being cooperative, claiming they had no obligation to help search for wreckage in international waters. Meanwhile, families around the world were demanding answers about their loved ones. I was working for a private salvage company contracted by the insurance consortium. Our job was simple: locate aircraft debris, recover what we could, and document everything for the investigation. We weren't supposed to find bodies. The ocean is usually efficient about disposing of human remains after a disaster like this. But the waters around Sakhalin Island aren't like anywhere else on Earth. The area where Flight 007 went down sits above an underwater trench that is over 6,000 feet deep. The currents are strange, creating dead zones where water barely moves. The temperature hovers just above freezing year-round. It's the kind of environment where things that should decay dawn, where things that should sink dawn, where things that should be forgotten Aaron, Our first dive was on September 15th, 12 days after the shoot-down. The water was darker than anything I'd experienced, even with powerful lights. Visibility was maybe 10 feet on a good day. We were working mostly by feel, following sonar contacts and hoping they led to aircraft wreckage. Instead, I found Mrs. Chen. She was floating 20 feet below the surface, perfectly preserved by the frigid water. An elderly Korean woman still wearing her seatbelt, still clutching her purse. Her eyes were open, staring upward toward a surface she would never reach again. But here, it's the thing that still haunts me. She looked peaceful. Not like someone who had died in terror as her plane broke apart. She looked like she was sleeping, waiting for something. That should have been my first warning that this recovery wasn't going to follow normal patterns. Over the next week, we found 17 more bodies scattered across a search area roughly the size of Manhattan. All perfectly preserved, all floating at different depths, like they'd been arranged in a three-dimensional constellation. All wearing the same expression of peaceful waiting. The recovery team, this mood grew darker with each find. Usually, discovering victims gives divers a sense of purpose, of bringing closure to grieving families. But these bodies felt different. They felt aware. It was Jimmy, one of the other divers, who first mentioned hearing voices underwater. He came up from a dive claiming he heard passengers calling out in Korean and English, asking for help, asking why we weren't answering them. The dive supervisor, a tough old Navy guy named Morrison, told Jimmy he was suffering from nitrogen narcosis. Talking to yourself underwater is common when you re-breathing compressed air at depth. Hearing voices answer back ISN, normal, but stress can do strange things to the mind. But then I started hearing them too. The voices were clearest when I was alone, working in the darker parts of the search area. Conversations in languages I didn't understand, but the meaning was somehow clear anyway. Passengers discussing their travel plans. Flight attendants going through safety procedures. A businessman talking about a meeting he did never attend. At first, I assumed Jimmy was right about the nitrogen. Diving at depth for extended periods can cause hallucinations. But the voices were too consistent, too detailed, and they weren't random chatter. They were trying to communicate with us. The breakthrough came during my 10th dive, when I found what remained of the aircraft, this passenger cabin. The fuselage had broken apart during the crash, scattering pieces across the ocean floor. But one section, roughly the size of a city bus, had settled intact in a depression between two underwater ridges. Inside were the seats, the overhead compartments, the small details that make an aircraft feel human-scaled rather than industrial. And inside were 43 passengers, still strapped in their seats, perfectly preserved by the cold water. They weren't floating like the others. They were sitting upright, facing forward, like they were still waiting for the plane to reach its destination. Some had reading materials open on their laps. Others had their hands folded, as if sleeping. But their eyes were all open, all looking directly at me. That is when I heard the voice that changed everything. Clear, speaking perfect English, coming from a middle-aged man in seat 23A. You have to help us understand what happened. I should have surfaced immediately. Should have reported what I found and let someone else deal with the psychological implications. Instead, I found myself responding, trying to explain the shoot down as simply as possible. The passenger listened patiently, his expression never changing. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said something that made my blood freeze. We know about the missiles. We felt the plane breaking apart. What we don't understand is why we're still here. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at bodies. I was looking at people who had died but hadn't left. 269 souls trapped in the moment of their death, unable to move forward, unable to understand why their journey had ended in the cold darkness of the North Pacific. I tried to surface, but my equipment malfunctioned. The air regulator stuck, flooding my mask with water. My depth gauge spun wildly. The safety line connecting me to the surface ship tangled around a piece of wreckage. As I struggled with the equipment failure, more voices joined the conversation. Passengers throughout the cabin were turning to look at me, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't hostile, but their attention was overwhelming. 43 people who had been denied their destinations, their final conversations, their chance to say goodbye. They wanted me to carry their messages. Each passenger had something they needed to communicate to the living world. Final words for spouses and children. Business deals that needed to be completed. Apologies for arguments that would never be resolved. But as I listened, I realized their messages weren't just about unfinished earthly business. They were warnings about something else, something that had been growing in the dark water since the night they died. The impact of their collective death had created a wound in reality itself. 269 people dying simultaneously in terror and confusion had torn a hole between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And that hole was growing. The passengers could see through it. They could see what was on the other side, and they were terrified. Something was using the opening they inadvertently created. Something that fed on human consciousness, on the electrical patterns that make up thoughts and memories. It had been consuming the passengers slowly, stealing pieces of their identity while keeping them trapped in their moment of death. But it wasn't satisfied with just the crash victims. It wanted more. It was learning to reach through the opening, to touch the minds of the living. The recovery divers were its first new targets. That is why we've been hearing voices. The thing wasn't just feeding on the dead passengers. It was learning to mimic them, to use their voices to lure the living closer to the opening. As this understanding washed over me, I felt something invisible wrap around my mind like cold fingers. My thoughts became sluggish, my memories distant. The entity was trying to pull me through the opening, to add my consciousness to its collection. The passengers in the cabin began screaming, not in terror, but in warning. They were fighting against the thing that had been feeding on them, using their collective will to push it back long enough for me to escape. I broke free of the tangled safety line and rocketed toward the surface, my equipment somehow functioning normally again. Behind me, I could feel the presence trying to follow, testing the boundaries of its underwater prison. When I broke the surface, gasping and shaking, the other divers pulled me aboard the recovery vessel. I tried to explain what I found, but the words came out as incoherent babbling about passengers and voices and things reaching through holes in reality. Morrison ordered me off diving duty, citing decompression sickness and psychological stress. He was probably right about the stress, but he was wrong about the cause. The recovery operation continued for 3 more weeks, but the character of the work changed dramatically. More divers reported equipment malfunctions. Several had to be pulled from the water in states of panic, claiming something was trying to drag them deeper. We recovered less than 30% of the aircraft and only 62 bodies. The official explanation was that the deep currents had scattered the wreckage across an impossibly wide area. But I knew the truth. The thing down there was protecting its territory, preventing us from documenting what it had done to the victims. The operation was called off in early October, with most of the wreckage and victims never recovered. The families were told their loved ones were lost forever in one of the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean. But they weren't lost. They were trapped. I tried to return to normal life, but the experience had marked me. I would wake up at night hearing Korean conversations I couldn't You understand? I would see faces of the passengers in crowds, always watching, always trying to communicate something urgent. The worst part was the gradual realization that I wasn't the only one affected. Other members of the recovery team began reporting similar experiences. Vivid dreams about airplane crashes, voices speaking in foreign languages, the persistent feeling of being watched by something that existed just outside normal perception. 3 divers from the operation committed suicide within the first year. 2 more disappeared without a trace. The official reports blamed post-traumatic stress and the psychological toll of working with disaster victims. But I knew what had really happened. The entity had found ways to reach through the opening, to continue harvesting consciousness from the living world. It was growing stronger, learning to extend its influence beyond the crash site. I started researching similar incidents, looking for patterns in aviation disasters and maritime tragedies. What I found convinced me that Flight 007 wasn't an isolated case. Every mass casualty event in deep water seemed to create similar phenomena. The Titanic, the Lusitania, military vessels sunk in wartime. All of them had reports of ghostly voices and supernatural encounters among the survivors and rescue workers. All of them had created openings that something hungry had learned to exploit. The entity that had claimed the passengers of Flight 007 was part of a larger network, an intelligence that existed in the spaces between life and death. It fed on human consciousness, using mass tragedies as entry points into our reality. And it was still growing. 30 years have passed since the recovery operation, but the voices haven't stopped. If anything, they've become stronger and more frequent. The passengers are still trying to warn us, still fighting against the thing that holds them prisoner. But their strength is failing. One by one, their voices are being replaced by something else. Something that is learned to mimic human speech perfectly but lacks the warmth that makes us human. I think the opening is widening. I think the entity is preparing for something larger than individual harvesting. The dreams I have now show me crowded places, airports, train stations, shopping malls, where hundreds of people suddenly stop moving, their eyes vacant, their consciousness pulled through invisible wounds in reality. The passengers of Flight 007 died trying to reach Seoul, but their journey isn't over. They were still traveling, still trying to complete their mission. But now their destination isn't a city in South Korea. It is a warning they need to deliver to the living world. Something is coming. Something that feeds on human consciousness and uses our own dead to hunt us. It has been preparing for decades, learning our weaknesses, building a network of openings between its realm and ours. The shoot-down of Flight 007 wasn't just a political tragedy or a military mistake. It was the opening of a door that should have stayed closed forever. And now, 30 years later, something is finally ready to walk through. Story 2. Iceman is cursed. They say Alaska keeps its secrets buried under layers of ice and darkness, but some secrets refuse to stay frozen. I learned this the hard way when I moved into the house on Hillside Drive in Anchorage, the same house where federal prosecutor Thomas Wales was murdered in his own home 25 years ago. What I discovered there still wakes me up screaming. The real estate agent never mentioned the murder. She focused on the panoramic views of Cook Inlet and the updated kitchen, carefully avoiding the basement office where Wales had been gunned down while working late one October night in 2001. I found out about the killing 3 days after signing the lease, when my neighbor casually mentioned it while we shared coffee over the fence. "You do know what happened in that house, right?" she asked, her breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The way she said it made my coffee taste like ash. Thomas Wales had been a man who made enemies. As a federal prosecutor, he put away white-collar criminals, organized crime figures, and corrupt politicians. But it was his work as an advocate for gun control that painted the biggest target on his back. In a state where firearms are considered sacred, Wales had made himself a marked man. The night he died, Wales was alone in his basement office, working on case files by the glow of his computer screen. The killer approached from outside, peering through the basement window like some predator studying prey. A single gunshot through the glass ended Wales' life instantly. The assassin vanished into the Anchorage night, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for decades. What the police never released to the public was what they found in that basement office. My neighbor, whose late husband had been on the investigation team, told me about the strange details that kept the case cold for so long. The killer had left no footprints in the snow outside the window, despite the fresh powder that had fallen hours before. The trajectory of the bullet suggested the shooter was impossibly tall, nearly 8 feet based on the angle. And the glass window showed a perfect circular hole, as if the bullet had been fired through ice rather than glass. I should have moved out right then. Instead, curiosity became my curse. The house felt normal during those first few weeks. I set up my home office in the same basement where Wales had died, telling myself I was being practical. The space had excellent lighting and was quiet enough for my work as a freelance journalist. But as the Alaska winter deepened and the nights stretched longer, I began noticing things that defied explanation. It started with the cold spots. Even with the furnace running at full blast, certain areas of the basement would drop to near freezing temperatures. My breath would mist when I walked past Wales' old desk, which the previous owners had left behind. The wood surface was scarred with what looked like bullet fragments, though the police had supposedly removed all evidence decades ago. Then came the sounds. Every night at exactly 11:15, I would hear footsteps in the snow outside the basement window. Slow, deliberate steps that circled the house like a predator stalking prey. When I looked outside, I saw nothing but unmarked snow stretching toward the tree line. The footsteps always stopped directly outside the office window, where an icy presence seemed to linger for exactly 3 minutes before moving on. I convinced myself it was wildlife. Alaska has plenty of creatures that move through suburban neighborhoods at night. But bears hibernate in winter, and no animal I knew moved with such methodical precision. The footsteps followed the same path every night, arriving and departing at identical times with clockwork accuracy. My investigation into Wales' murder became an obsession. I spent hours in the Anchorage library, poring over newspaper archives and police reports. The case had all the hallmarks of a professional hit. The killer knew Wales' routine, understood the layout of the house, and possessed the marksmanship skills to make a fatal shot through a basement window in near total darkness. The FBI had investigated dozens of suspects over the years. Disgruntled defendants Wales had prosecuted, gun rights extremists who opposed his advocacy work, and shadowy figures from organized crime families he helped dismantle. But every lead went cold. Every suspect had an alibi, and the killer remained a ghost haunting the case files. What struck me most was the temperature evidence the police had documented. On the night of the murder, the basement office had been found at a bone-chilling 32 degrees, despite the central heating running normally throughout the rest of the house. Investigators attributed this to the broken window letting in October air, but weather reports showed temperatures at night had been in the low 40s. Something else had brought that killing cold into Thomas Wales' final moments. As I dug deeper into the case, the nightly disturbances in my own basement grew more intense. The cold spots expanded until I needed winter clothing to work at my desk. Ice began forming on the interior walls, creating crystalline patterns that resembled bullet trajectories when the light hit them at certain angles. My computer screen would flicker and display fragments of text that looked like legal documents, though I never opened such files. The breakthrough came when I discovered Wales' personal notes, hidden in a safety deposit box that his family had overlooked for decades. I tracked down his surviving relatives through genealogy websites, and his elderly sister agreed to meet me at a downtown coffee shop. She handed me a key she found among her brother's belongings, along with the location of a bank branch that had since closed and reopened under new management. Inside that safety deposit box were Wales' private files on cases the FBI had never seen. He'd been investigating a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Alaska's government and business community. Mining permits had been granted through bribery and intimidation. Environmental protection laws were being systematically dismantled to benefit a small group of wealthy investors. And at the center of it all was a figure Wales referred to only as the Iceman. According to Wales' notes, the Iceman was a professional killer who specialized in making murders look like accidents or random crimes. His calling card was the supernatural cold that would descend on crime scenes, freezing evidence and confusing investigators. Wales believed the Iceman had been responsible for at least 6 deaths across Alaska over a 15-year period, all people who had threatened to expose the conspiracy. The most chilling detail was Wales' final entry, dated just 3 days before his murder. He received a phone call from someone claiming to be the Iceman, warning him to drop his investigation or face the consequences. The caller's voice was described as like wind across a glacier, and during the conversation, Wales His office temperature had dropped so dramatically that his coffee cup froze solid while he held it. Reading those notes in my basement office, I felt the familiar cold creeping in around me. But this time it was different. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath came out in clouds and frost began forming on my keyboard as I typed. The computer screen flickered and displayed a single line of text that made my blood freeze in my veins. Stop digging or join him. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The cold was so intense it seemed to slow time itself. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the basement stairs, even though I knew I was alone in the house. Each step brought a wave of Arctic air that made my bones ache with supernatural chill. When I finally reached the main floor, gasping and stumbling, the basement door slammed shut behind me with enough force to shake the entire house. The temperature upstairs remained normal, as if the killing cold was contained to the space where Thomas Wales had died. I spent that night in a motel, but I couldn't escape what I learned. The Iceman wasn't just a hired killer. He was something far worse. Wales' notes contained references to Inuit legends about spirits of the ice, entities that could inhabit human forms and bring the killing cold of the Arctic wherever they went. The conspiracy Wales had discovered wasn't just about money and corruption. It was about something ancient and evil that had been using Alaska, this harsh environment, to hide its crimes for generations. The next morning, I found my house surrounded by police cars. My neighbor had called them after hearing what sounded like gunshots coming from the basement around 11:15 the previous night. When officers investigated, they found the basement office in the exact same condition as the night Thomas Wales was murdered. The window was shattered with a perfect circular hole. The temperature was a bone-chilling 32 degrees, and ice covered every surface like a crime scene preserved in time. But this time, there was no body. Instead, they found Wales' hidden files scattered across the desk, along with a single sheet of paper covered in frost. When the ice melted, it revealed a list of names written in Thomas Wales' handwriting. Every person on that list had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 25 years. Their deaths ruled as accidents, suicides, or unsolved murders. At the bottom of the list, written in different handwriting that seemed to burn with cold fire, was my own name. I left Alaska that same day, but I know the Iceman, his curse followed me. No matter how far south I travel, no matter how warm the climate, I can feel the killing cold waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. Every night at 11:15, the temperature drops wherever I happen to be, and I hear those methodical footsteps circling, always circling, like a predator that has found its next prey. Thomas Wales thought he could expose the truth and bring justice to Alaska's dark corners. Instead, he discovered that some secrets are guarded by forces older and more ruthless than human corruption. The ice remembers everything, and in Alaska's endless winter nights, the dead never truly rest. They're still out there, the Iceman and his conspiracy of silence, using the cover of America, this last frontier, to hide crimes that would make your blood freeze. And somewhere in the darkness of an Anchorage basement, the ghost of Thomas Wales still sits at his desk, forever trying to finish the case that cost him his life. The curse of the ice never melts. It only waits for the next person foolish enough to dig too deep into Alaska's frozen secrets. Story 3. Tundra Inupiat vampire. They found my partner's body 3 miles from the drilling site with no blood left in his veins and claw marks that belonged to no animal on Earth. That was 67 days into the polar night on Alaska's North Slope, and I should have gotten on the next plane out. Instead, I stayed to finish our geological survey, and what I discovered in that endless darkness still haunts me every time the sun goes down. My name is Marcus Webb, and I used to work for Petro-Arctic surveying oil deposits in some of the most remote places on the planet. The assignment that changed my life was a 3-month winter mapping project near Utqiagvik, the northernmost town in Alaska. What the company never told us was that we would be working in the traditional territory of something the local Inupiat called the Turn Gate, a shapeshifter that feeds on human life during the months when the sun never rises. Danny Martinez had been my surveying partner for 8 years. We had worked everywhere from the Sahara to Siberia, but Alaska, this North Slope, was different. The isolation hit you like a physical weight. For 2 months of polar night, the sun never breaks the horizon. The temperature drops to -40 without factoring wind chill. The landscape becomes an endless void of white that swallows sound, light, and hope. Our base camp was a collection of heated trailers 20 miles from the nearest village. The only connection to civilization was a satellite radio that worked when the weather cooperated. Danny and I had done this type of work before, but something about the North Slope felt wrong from day one. The silence was too complete. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the darkness itself was absorbing every sound. The Inupiat crew members who helped us set up camp moved with nervous energy. They spoke in hushed tones and kept glancing toward the tree line, though there were no trees for hundreds of miles. Their supervisor, a weathered man named Joseph Tutu, pulled me aside before they left us alone with our equipment. "You watch the horizon at night," he said, his breath forming ice crystals in the frigid air. "If you see lights moving where no lights should be, you radio the village immediately. Do not investigate, do not go outside, and whatever you do, never invite anything inside that knocks on your trailer door after midnight." I thought he was trying to spook the newcomers with local folklore. Every isolated community has ghost stories designed to keep outsiders on edge. But Joseph's eyes held no humor, only the kind of fear that comes from experience. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks into our stay. Danny had been taking core samples about 2 miles northeast of camp when he radioed that he had found something unusual. Not geological samples, but bones. Lots of bones, all bleached white and scattered across a frozen creek bed like some ancient killing ground. When I reached his location, the sight made my stomach turn. Hundreds of bones littered the ice, everything from caribou and Arctic fox to what looked unmistakably human. But these were not normal remains. Every bone showed the same strange markings, deep gouges that could have been made by claws or teeth, but following patterns too deliberate to be from any predator I knew. Danny was crouched beside a human skull that had been cracked open like an egg. The bone marrow cavity was completely clean, polished smooth as if something had systematically extracted every trace of organic material. More disturbing were the teeth marks on the skull's exterior. They were human-sized but far too sharp, with an odd spacing that suggested a mouth larger than any person could possess. "What kind of animal does this?" Danny asked, holding up a femur that had been split lengthwise with surgical precision. I had no answer. The bone showed no signs of weathering despite being exposed to the harsh Arctic environment. This killing ground was recent, maybe weeks old rather than the ancient burial site I had first assumed. Something was actively hunting in this area, and we had set up camp directly in its territory. That night, I radioed Joseph Tutu to report our discovery. The connection was poor, full of static and strange echoes, but I managed to describe the bone field. The silence that followed lasted so long I thought we had lost contact entirely. Finally, Joseph's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted by interference. "You need to move your camp. Tonight, that place is a feeding ground for the Turngate. It only hunts during the dark months, but once it finds prey, it never stops until it feeds." The radio went dead before I could ask what a Turngate was. Danny and I spent the next hour trying to reestablish contact, but the satellite connection had gone completely dark. We were alone in the polar night with something that had created a killing ground 2 miles from our camp. Moving camp in Arctic conditions is not a decision you make lightly. Our trailers were anchored against windstorms that could reach 100 miles per hour. The heating systems were calibrated for our specific location, and relocating in darkness across uneven terrain could be fatal if we hit a hidden crevasse or got caught in a whiteout. Danny voted to stay put and finish the survey as quickly as possible. We had expensive equipment scattered across a 5-mile radius, core samples that represented weeks of work, and a company contract that would hold us financially responsible for any abandoned gear. Against my better judgment, I agreed to continue the mission. That decision cost Danny his life. The attacks started subtly. Equipment would malfunction in ways that made no technical sense. Brand new batteries would drain overnight in temperatures well within their operating range. GPS units would show our location as shifting several miles between readings taken minutes apart. Most disturbing, our motion sensors began detecting movement around the camp perimeter every night between 2 and 4 a.m. The sensors were military grade, designed to distinguish between human intruders and wildlife. But the readings we got made no sense. The motion patterns showed something circling our camp at inhuman speed, covering ground in ways that defied basic physics. The heat signatures were inconsistent, sometimes showing body temperatures far below what any living creature could survive, other times registering heat levels that would indicate something was literally on fire. On the 59th night, Danny volunteered to check the sensors manually. Something had triggered them repeatedly for 3 hours straight, always from the same location about 100 yards north of camp. He took a rifle, a thermal imaging scope, and a radio with fresh batteries. I monitored his progress from inside the communications trailer. His voice came through clearly as he approached the sensor location. I can see the device, but there is nothing here that should have triggered it. Wait, there are tracks in the snow. Really strange tracks. The radio went silent. I called his name repeatedly, but got no response. The motion sensors showed his heat signature had vanished completely, as if he had simply ceased to exist. I grabbed emergency flares and a shotgun, then followed his trail into the darkness. Danny, his tracks led straight toward the sensor, then stopped abruptly in a perfect circle of disturbed snow about 20 feet in diameter. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of where he had gone. But surrounding his last footprints were marks I had never seen before. The tracks looked almost human, but wrong in every detail. The feet were too long and narrow, with what appeared to be claws instead of toes. The stride length suggested something over 7 feet tall, but the depth of the impressions indicated far less weight than a creature that size should possess. Most unsettling, the tracks seemed to spiral inward toward where Danny had been standing, as if something had circled him like a predator before striking. I followed the strange tracks away from Danny, his last known position. They led across the frozen landscape in a perfectly straight line, ignoring obstacles that would force any normal creature to detour. The prints went directly over ice ridges, through snowdrifts, and across terrain that should have been impassable. 3 miles from camp, the tracks ended at a site that turned my blood to ice water. Danny, his body lay spread eagle on a flat section of permafrost, completely drained of blood. His skin was paper white, pulled tight against his bones as if every drop of fluid had been extracted from his body. But there were no visible wounds, no puncture marks or tears that would explain such massive blood loss. The claw marks I would later describe to investigators covered Danny, his torso in precise patterns. They were too deep and too clean to be from any natural predator. Each gouge followed the path of major blood vessels with surgical accuracy. Whatever had killed Danny possessed intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the patience to feed methodically rather than simply attacking in a frenzy. Most disturbing was Danny, his expression. His eyes were wide open, staring at the star-filled sky with what looked like wonder rather than terror. His mouth was open as if he had been trying to speak when he died. There was no indication he had struggled or even tried to defend himself. I radioed for immediate evacuation, but the helicopter rescue would not arrive for 3 days due to incoming weather. That meant spending 72 hours alone at the camp where something had just demonstrated its ability to kill with impunity. I barricaded myself inside the communications trailer and tried to stay awake, knowing that whatever had taken Danny was still out there in the darkness. The attacks on the trailer started before midnight. Something began systematically testing every potential entry point, probing the doors and windows with a patience that felt more human than animal. I could hear claws scraping against the metal walls, moving in deliberate patterns as if mapping the trailer as construction. Then came the sounds I will never forget. Through the thin walls, I heard Danny, his voice calling my name. Not screaming or crying for help, but speaking in conversational tones as if he wanted to chat about our work. The voice was perfect in every detail, matching Danny, his accent and speech patterns exactly. "Marcus, why are you hiding in there? I found something incredible out here. You need to see this. It changes everything we thought we knew about the geological formations." I knew Danny was dead. I had seen his bloodless corpse with my own eyes, but his voice continued circling the trailer, always staying just outside my line of sight through the windows. The thermal imaging showed no heat signature, yet I could clearly hear footsteps crunching through the snow. "Come on, partner. I know you can hear me. This discovery is going to make us famous. Open the door and I'll show you what I found." The voice was accompanied by gentle knocking, the same pattern Danny always used when we were working in separate trailers. 3 quick raps, pause, then 2 more. It was such a perfectly human gesture that doubt began creeping into my mind. What if Danny had somehow survived? What if I had been mistaken about what I saw in the darkness? I moved toward the door with my hand on the handle, ready to let my partner back inside where it was warm and safe. Then I remembered Joseph Tutu's warning about never inviting anything inside that knocks after midnight. My watch showed 2:47 a.m. Instead of opening the door, I called out to ask Danny a question only he would know the answer to. "What was the name of your daughter?" "It was Goldfish." The knocking stopped immediately. The voice that responded was still Danny, but somehow wrong in a way I could not define. "You know, I don't. You have a daughter, Marcus. Why are you asking strange questions? Just open the door. Danny had 3 daughters and was constantly showing me pictures of them. The thing outside wearing his voice had made a critical error, revealing that it was not my partner returned from the dead but something else entirely. The attacks continued for the next 2 nights. Each time, the creature would arrive wearing a different voice. First my ex-wife, then my father who had died 5 years earlier, then childhood friends I had not spoken to in decades. The voices were always perfect reproductions, but the words revealed that the thing creating them had no access to human memories, only the ability to mimic sounds with supernatural accuracy. During daylight hours, I found tracks circling the camp in patterns that made no geometric sense. The creature seemed to move through 3-dimensional space without regard for gravity or solid barriers. Tracks would appear on the trailer roof, descend the walls, and continue across the ground as if the thing could walk on any surface regardless of orientation. The helicopter rescue arrived on schedule, but by then I had discovered something that made the touring gate far more terrifying than a simple predator. Hidden in Danny's geological notes were references to similar discoveries across the North Slope. Bone fields, drained corpses, and reports of shape-shifting creatures that matched local legends going back hundreds of years. The Inupiat had names for different types of touring gate. Some were spirits of the dead seeking revenge. Others were ancient beings that had never been human at all. But the one that hunted during the polar night was described as something between the 2 categories, a creature that had once been human but had been transformed by exposure to forces older than recorded history. According to the legends, the touring gate could only be destroyed by exposing it to sunlight, which explained why it was only active during the months of complete darkness. But on Alaska's North Slope, those months stretched from November to January, giving the creature nearly 3 months of hunting time each year. The helicopter pilot who evacuated me was an Inupiat elder named Robert Akivgik. During the flight back to civilization, he told me that Danny and I were not the first outsiders to encounter the touring gate. Over the past century, dozens of researchers, oil workers, and government surveyors had vanished or died under mysterious circumstances during the polar night. The old stories say it was once a shaman who tried to gain power by feeding on human life, Robert explained over the helicopter, this intercom. But the spirits punished him by making him dependent on blood to survive, and cursing him to burn in sunlight like ice melts in fire. Now he hunts every winter, and each person he kills makes him stronger. I never returned to Alaska, this North Slope, but the touring gate followed me south. During the darkest months of winter, no matter where I am, I can feel something watching from the shadows. My blood runs cold when I hear familiar voices calling my name from empty rooms. And every year when the nights grow long, I remember Danny's face in the starlight and wonder how many more people will vanish into the darkness before someone finds a way to stop the thing that should never have existed. The polar night is coming again, and somewhere in the Arctic wasteland, the touring gate is waking from its summer sleep, hungry for fresh blood and new voices to steal. Story 4. Lost Patrol. The GPS coordinates I found in my grandfather's war chest led me to 4 frozen corpses that had been perfectly preserved in the Yukon ice for over a century. What I discovered about how they died still keeps me awake at night, because the official story of the Lost Patrol was a lie designed to hide something far more terrifying than simple death by exposure. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a search and rescue coordinator for the Alaska State Troopers. Last winter, while cleaning out my late grandfather's belongings, I found a leather pouch containing a hand-drawn map, 4 brass buttons from Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniforms, and coordinates written in fading ink. My grandfather had served with the Army Corps of Engineers in Alaska during World War II, but he never spoke about his time up north. Now I know why. The coordinates pointed to a location in the Yukon Territory, about 60 miles northeast of Fort McPherson. According to the map, this was where Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and his 3-man patrol had really died in 1911, not the official location where their bodies were supposedly found months later. The mystery of the Lost Patrol was one of the most famous unsolved cases in Canadian history, but my grandfather's hidden documents suggested the truth had been buried along with the men who discovered it. I should have turned the information over to Canadian authorities and let them handle the investigation. Instead, I took vacation time and flew to Whitehorse with a portable ground-penetrating radar unit and enough supplies for a week-long expedition. What I told myself was professional curiosity was really something darker, an obsession that had been building since childhood whenever my grandfather would stare out at winter storms with haunted eyes. The official story of the Lost Patrol was straightforward enough. In December 1910, Inspector Fitzgerald led Constables Kinney, Taylor, and Carter on a routine winter patrol from Fort McPherson to Dawson City. They were supposed to follow established trails and arrive within a month. When they failed to reach Dawson City by February, search parties were organized. The patrol's bodies were eventually found along the Peel River, apparently having gotten lost in a blizzard and died of starvation and exposure. But my grandfather's map showed a completely different route, one that led deep into unmapped wilderness where no official patrol would have any reason to go. The coordinates were marked with symbols I had never seen before, geometric patterns that looked almost ritualistic. At the bottom of the map, written in my grandfather's handwriting, were the words they were running from something. The flight to the coordinates required a bush pilot willing to land on frozen terrain in one of the most remote areas of North America. I found a grizzled veteran named Tommy Blackstone who had spent 40 years flying supplies to mining camps and research stations. When I showed him the coordinates, his face went pale. "That is cursed land," he said, studying the map with obvious reluctance. "The local First Nations want to go near that area, haven for generations. They call it the place where the ice bleeds. I can get you there, but I'm not staying overnight, and I'm not coming back after dark." The flight took us over hundreds of miles of unbroken wilderness, white as far as the eye could see in every direction. This was country where a person could disappear completely, where search parties might never find remains even if they knew exactly where to look. As we approached the coordinates, Tommy pointed out landmarks that matched my grandfather's map with disturbing accuracy. "There," he said, indicating a ridge of black rock protruding through the snow. "That's the formation your grandfather marked. But I'm telling you right now, something about this place feels wrong. The compass is spinning like crazy, and my radio is picking up interference I've never heard before." He was right about the interference. Through the aircraft's communication system, I could hear sounds that resembled voices speaking in a language that hurt to listen to. The words seemed to bypass my ears and embed themselves directly in my brain, creating images of vast frozen spaces and things moving beneath the ice. Tommy landed the plane on a flat section of permafrost about half a mile from the coordinates. As soon as we touched down, the temperature inside the aircraft dropped noticeably despite the heater running at full power. Outside, the thermometer read -35 degrees, but it felt much colder, the kind of cold that penetrates clothing and settles in your bones. I unloaded my equipment while Tommy kept the engine running. The ground-penetrating radar immediately began showing anomalous readings, subsurface structures that looked too regular to be natural rock formations. According to the display, there was a large cavity about 15 feet below the surface, roughly the size of a small building. "I'll be back at this exact spot in 6 hours, Tommy called out over the engine noise. "If you're not here when I return, I'm leaving without you. This place gives me the creeps, and I've seen enough weird stuff in 40 years of flying to trust my instincts." The plane disappeared into the gray sky, leaving me alone in a silence so complete it felt like being inside a tomb. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the black ridge my grandfather had marked on his map. But as I began hiking toward the coordinates, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The snow around the ridge was stained with what looked like rust-colored streaks, as if iron-rich water was seeping up from below. The patterns were too geometric to be natural, forming spirals and angular shapes that reminded me of the symbols on my grandfather's map. More disturbing, the stained areas felt warm through my boots, as if something was generating heat beneath the permafrost. The ground-penetrating radar led me to a section where the surface snow had melted and refrozen into a smooth sheet of ice. Beneath the transparent layer, I could see dark shapes that looked unmistakably human. 4 bodies arranged in a perfect square, still wearing the distinctive red tunics of Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniforms. I spent 2 hours with a portable ice melter, carefully exposing the bodies without damaging them. What I found challenged everything I thought I knew about death by exposure. Inspector Fitzgerald and his 3 constables were perfectly preserved, but their expressions were not those of men who had died slowly from cold and starvation. Each face was frozen in a mask of absolute terror, eyes wide and mouths open as if they had been screaming when death took them. Their hands were clawed and bloody, fingernails torn off from what appeared to be desperate digging. Most disturbing, their bodies were positioned as if they had been trying to dig themselves deeper into the ground, not seeking shelter from the elements but attempting to hide from something above. The constables' equipment was scattered around their bodies in patterns that made no tactical sense. Rifles had been thrown aside fully loaded, as if the men had realized their weapons were useless against whatever they faced. Personal effects were arranged in careful geometric shapes, matching the symbols on my grandfather's map exactly. But it was what I found in Inspector Fitzgerald's coat pocket that made my blood freeze. A journal, perfectly preserved in the ice, containing entries that documented the patrol's final days. According to Fitzgerald's increasingly frantic handwriting, they had not gotten lost on a routine patrol. They had been pursuing something. The journal entries began normally enough. December 15, 1910, following reports of strange lights and missing trappers in the Northern Territory. Local natives refused to guide us, speaking of ancient evils awakening. December 18th, found the trapper's cabin. No bodies, but signs of struggle. Something dragged them into the wilderness, leaving tracks unlike any animal I know. As the entries continued, Fitzgerald's language became more desperate. December 22nd, the thing we re-following doesn't leave consistent tracks. Sometimes human footprints, sometimes claws, sometimes shapes I cannot identify. It's leading us deeper into unmapped territory, away from all known trails. December 25th, Christmas Day. Carter claims he can hear voices calling his name from empty forest. The horses are terrified, refusing to continue north. We should turn back, but the creature took another family yesterday. 3 children. We cannot abandon our duty. The final entries were barely legible, written by firelight in increasingly shaky handwriting. December 29th. It is not one creature. There are dozens of them, moving beneath the ice like sharks beneath water. They surface only to feed, then disappear back into tunnels that shouldn't to exist in permafrost. December 30th. Kinney is gone, pulled through solid ice as if it were water. We heard him screaming from below ground for hours before the sound stopped. The things are playing with us, studying how we behave when hunted. The last entry was dated December 31st, 1910. They surrounded us, moving through the earth itself, coming up through cracks in the permafrost. Cannot fight what we cannot see or understand. If anyone finds this record, do not come looking for us. Some mysteries should stay buried in the ice. I photographed every page of the journal with my satellite phone, knowing this evidence would rewrite Canadian history. But as I worked, the temperature continued dropping despite clear skies and no wind. The ground beneath me began making sounds like settling timber, as if massive structures were shifting deep underground. The first crack appeared in the ice directly beneath Inspector Fitzgerald's body. A hairline fracture that widened as I watched, revealing darkness that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam. From somewhere far below came sounds that raised every primitive instinct in my brain, a combination of scraping, breathing, and something that might have been communication. I backed away from the bodies, but cracks were spreading across the entire area in the same geometric patterns I had seen in the stained snow. The permafrost was becoming unstable, as if my presence had triggered some kind of geological response. Or something below had detected me and was preparing to surface. The ground-penetrating radar began showing movement in the subsurface cavity, multiple objects the size of large animals, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random behavior. They were rising toward the surface, following tunnel networks that extended for miles in every direction. I ran for the rendezvous point where Tommy would collect me, but the ice was failing faster than I could move. Behind me, I heard the sound of frozen earth splitting open like a massive egg hatching. The air filled with a smell I had never encountered before, something between decay and ozone that made my lungs burn with each breath. I reached the landing zone with 30 minutes to spare before Tommy's scheduled return. The aircraft appeared on schedule, but as it approached, I could see Tommy gesturing frantically from the cockpit. The radio crackled with his voice, distorted by the same interference we had experienced earlier. "Get in now! Something is coming up through the ice behind you. Multiple heat signatures, moving fast." I turned to see the entire area where I had found the lost patrol erupting in clouds of steam and debris. Dark shapes were emerging from the fractured permafrost, too distant to make out details but moving with purpose toward my location. The ground beneath the aircraft began vibrating as if something massive was approaching from underground. Tommy had the plane moving before I finished strapping myself in. As we gained altitude, I looked down at the coordinates where Inspector Fitzgerald and his men had made their final stand. The ice field was broken and scarred, with dark openings leading into tunnels that stretched beyond the horizon. Steam rose from the openings like breath in cold air, and I swear I could see movement in the depths. "What the hell did you find down there?" Tommy shouted over the engine noise. I showed him the photographs of Fitzgerald's journal, but he shook his head after reading the first few entries. "That is impossible. Permafrost doesn't have tunnel networks. It is solid frozen ground, has been for thousands of years." But we both knew what we had seen. Something lived beneath the Yukon ice, something that had been hunting humans for over a century. The Lost Patrol had not died from exposure and starvation. They had been killed by predators that moved through the earth itself, creatures that had learned to use the vast network of caves and tunnels hidden beneath Alaska's frozen surface. My grandfather's documents revealed that military engineers had discovered similar tunnel systems across the Arctic during World War II. Every site was classified and sealed, the locations marked as hazardous terrain on official maps. The brass buttons in his collection came from other patrols that had encountered the underground predators, evidence of a cover-up that had lasted 8 decades. The Canadian authorities classified my findings as a hoax despite the photographic evidence. The coordinates were declared a restricted archaeological site, and the area was placed off limits to civilian aircraft. But I know the truth about what happened to Inspector Fitzgerald and his men, and why the official story of the Lost Patrol was a carefully constructed lie. Somewhere beneath the ice of the Yukon Territory, an ancient ecosystem continues to thrive. Predators that evolved to hunt in 3 dimensions, moving through solid permafrost as easily as fish swim through water. They have been taking humans for generations, leaving just enough evidence to create legends but never enough to prove their existence. The Lost Patrol discovered this truth in 1911, and died trying to warn the world about predators that should not exist. Their sacrifice was buried along with their bodies, classified as a tragic accident rather than the first documented encounter with something that challenges our understanding of life on Earth. But the ice remembers everything, and climate change is melting the permafrost that has kept these creatures contained for thousands of years. Soon, the tunnels will reach the surface, and the things that killed the Lost Patrol will spread into a world unprepared for predators that hunt from below. Story 5. Phantom hiker of Flattop Mountain. The man who led me off the trail on Flattop Mountain had no shadow, but I only noticed this after following him for 3 miles into terrain that does not exist on any map of Alaska. What I discovered in that impossible wilderness still haunts my dreams, because I learned that some people who go missing in the mountains never actually died at all. My name is David Chen, and I used to be a weekend warrior like millions of other Americans. Every Saturday morning, I would drive from my apartment in Anchorage to the Chugach Mountains for a day hike, usually the popular Flattop Mountain Trail that attracts hundreds of tourists and locals each week. The trail is well marked, heavily trafficked, and considered one of the safest hikes in Alaska. That reputation made what happened to me even more terrifying. It was mid-September when I first saw the phantom hiker. I had started the Flattop Trail at dawn to avoid crowds and was about halfway to the summit when I noticed another hiker ahead of me, moving with the steady pace of someone experienced in mountain terrain. He wore standard outdoor gear, a red jacket and dark backpack that looked exactly like what you would see on any Alaska hiking trail. What struck me as odd was his timing. I had been the first person to reach the trailhead that morning, and I had not seen anyone pass me on the narrow path. The mystery hiker seemed to have appeared from nowhere, already well ahead of my position despite my early start. I picked up my pace to catch up, thinking it would be nice to have company for the summit push. The man stayed consistently ahead of me, always just visible around the next switchback or rocky outcrop. His movement seemed effortless, covering ground that left me breathing hard with no apparent exertion. As I followed him higher up the mountain, I began noticing details that made my skin crawl. The hiker never stopped to rest, never paused to check his bearings or consult a map. Most disturbing, he never looked back despite the obvious sounds I was making on the rocky trail behind him. It was as if he knew exactly where he was going and was completely unaware of my presence. The trail began deviating from the route I knew. Instead of following the established switchbacks toward Flattop's distinctive summit, the path started winding into areas I had never seen before. Dense stands of spruce and birch that should not have existed at that elevation. Creek crossings that appeared on no topographical map of the region. I should have turned back when I realized we were no longer on the official trail. Every piece of hiking wisdom I had learned over 20 years of outdoor experience screamed that I was making a dangerous mistake. But something about the phantom hiker compelled me to keep following, as if my rational mind had been overridden by a more primitive instinct. The forest around us grew darker and more oppressive as we climbed into terrain that defied the geology of the Chugach Mountains. The trees were larger and older than anything that should have been growing at that altitude. Moss hung from branches in thick curtains that blocked out most of the morning sunlight. The air itself felt different, thicker and more humid than Alaska, its typically dry mountain environment. After 3 miles of following the mystery trail, I stopped to check my GPS unit and get my bearings. The device showed my location as a blank area with no terrain features marked. According to the satellite readings, I was standing in the middle of empty space, miles from any known trail or geographical landmark. When I looked up from the GPS, the phantom hiker had vanished completely. The trail ahead was empty, with no sign that anyone had passed this way recently. But I could hear something moving through the forest around me, footsteps that seemed to circle my position without ever coming close enough to see clearly. I tried to retrace my route back to the official Flat-Top Trail, but the path I had followed uphill had completely disappeared. The forest closed in around me like a maze, with game trails leading in every direction but none of them familiar. Every tree looked identical, every rock formation seemed to repeat in endless variations. Panic began setting in as I realized I was genuinely lost in an area that should not have existed. I had hiked the Chugach Mountains for decades and knew every trail within 50 miles of Anchorage. Yet I was standing in a forest that felt ancient and untouched, filled with sounds I had never heard in Alaska, its wilderness. The noises were the most unsettling part, not the familiar sounds of wind through spruce trees or distant bird calls, but something that resembled human voices having conversations just beyond the range of understanding. The words were almost clear enough to comprehend but remained maddeningly indistinct, like trying to eavesdrop on a conversation in the next room. As afternoon turned toward evening, the phantom voices grew louder and more distinct. I could make out individual speakers, men and women of various ages, all discussing topics that made no sense in context. Weather reports from decades past, fragments of radio broadcasts, conversations about events that had not happened yet. Then I began hearing my own name spoken by voices I recognized. Friends from college, coworkers from my current job, family members both living and dead. They were calling for me to join them, promising warmth and safety if I would just walk a little further into the forest. I knew these voices were not real, but the psychological pressure was overwhelming. After hours of being lost in impossible terrain, the promise of human contact was almost irresistible. I found myself walking toward the sounds, pushing through underbrush that seemed to part specifically for my passage. The voices led me to a clearing I will never be able to describe adequately. It was simultaneously familiar and alien, like a childhood memory that has been distorted by time and trauma. In the center of the space stood the phantom hiker who had led me off the trail, but now I could see him clearly for what he really was. The man looked normal from a distance, but up close the illusion fell apart. His features were too perfect, like a photograph that has been slightly over-sharpened. His clothes showed no signs of wear despite the rough terrain we had covered. Most disturbing, when sunlight hit him at certain angles, I could see straight through his body to the trees behind him. Around the clearing were dozens of other hikers, all wearing outdoor gear from different decades. Some had equipment from the 1970s, others wore modern technical clothing, but all shared the same slightly translucent appearance as the phantom who had led me here. They moved through the space with purpose but no urgency, like actors rehearsing a play they had performed countless times. I understood then that I was looking at every hiker who had gone missing in the Chugach Mountains over the past 50 years. People who had started out on well-marked trails and simply vanished, leaving behind search teams with no clues and families with no closure. They were all here, trapped in this impossible place between the real world and something else entirely. The phantom hiker approached me with a smile that was too wide and too knowing. He gestured toward the other missing people as if offering an introduction to a social gathering. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was a combination of every person who had ever called my name, layered together in harmonies that hurt to hear. The message was clear even without words. I could join their community of the lost, give up the struggle of finding my way back to the real world, and accept the peace of simply not existing in any conventional sense. The offer was genuinely tempting after hours of terror and confusion in the phantom forest. But I noticed something that gave me hope. Unlike the other trapped hikers, I still cast a shadow in the clearing, this strange light. Whatever process had claimed them had not yet completed its work on me. I was still connected enough to the real world to potentially escape. I ran from the clearing without looking back, crashing through underbrush that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me, the voices of the phantom hikers rose in what might have been anger or disappointment, calling my name with increasing desperation as I put distance between us. The forest began changing as I ran, becoming more familiar and less oppressive. The trees grew smaller, the moss thinned out, and actual sunlight began penetrating the canopy. After what felt like hours of desperate flight, I stumbled out of the tree line onto the legitimate flat-top mountain trail, just a few hundred yards from the parking area. Other hikers were coming down the mountain as evening approached, normal people with normal shadows who looked at me with concern as I emerged from the forest covered in scratches and obviously shaken. I told them I had gotten turned around on a side trail, which was true enough without revealing the impossible details. The official missing persons reports I researched later confirmed what I had seen in the phantom clearing. Over the past half-century, 43 people had vanished while hiking alone in the Chugach Mountains. All were experienced outdoor enthusiasts who knew the trails well. All were last seen heading toward popular destinations on well-marked paths. None had ever been found despite extensive search efforts. But now I knew where they were, trapped in a place that existed alongside our world but followed different rules. The phantom hiker who had led me astray was collecting people, building a community of the lost in a forest that should not have been able to exist in Alaska's mountains. I stopped hiking alone after that experience, but even in groups I sometimes catch glimpses of the red jacket moving through trees just off the established trails. The phantom hiker is still out there, still leading people into terrain that does not appear on any map. And somewhere in an impossible clearing, dozens of missing hikers continue their eternal gathering, waiting for the next lost soul to join their ranks. The Chugach Mountains look the same as they always have from Anchorage, but I know now that they contain spaces between spaces, pockets of unreality where the rules of physics and geography do not apply. The phantom hiker guards these thresholds, luring the unwary into a realm where going missing is not death but something far worse. Every time I drive past the flat-top mountain trailhead, I see cars parked there belonging to solo hikers who started their day planning a simple mountain adventure. I wonder how many of them will make it back to their vehicles when evening falls, and how many will follow a helpful stranger in a red jacket into a forest that should not exist. The mountains are patient, and the phantom hiker never stops searching for new residents in his impossible wilderness. Story 6. Tsunami of the Dead. The ghost ship I found stranded 20 miles inland from Seward contained the perfectly preserved bodies of 37 people who died in the 1964 Good Friday tsunami. But according to the passenger manifest, only 36 people were supposed to be on board. The extra corpse wore my father's face and had been waiting 60 years for me to find him. My name is Robert Hayes, and I am a demolition contractor from Seattle who specializes in clearing disaster sites. Last spring, the Alaska Department of Transportation hired me to remove debris from the 1964 earthquake that was finally being exposed by melting permafrost. Climate change was revealing wreckage that had been frozen in place for decades, including structures that official records claimed had been completely destroyed. The Good Friday earthquake hit Alaska at 5:36 p.m. on March 27, 1964. Measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale, it remains the second most powerful earthquake ever recorded. The quake lasted 4.5 minutes, long enough to liquefy solid ground and drop entire city blocks below sea level. But it was the tsunamis that followed that created the real horror, waves over 200 feet tall that erased entire communities from the map. What the history books do not tell you is that some of those communities never stayed erased. Every few decades, melting ice or shifting permafrost reveals buildings, vehicles, and victims from 1964 that should have been swept out to sea or buried beyond recovery. The state quietly removes these anomalies before the public can see them, maintaining the official narrative that the disaster was thoroughly documented and all victims accounted for. I learned about the cover-up from my supervisor at the Department of Transportation, a grizzled engineer named Carl Brennan who had been dealing with earthquake anomalies for 30 years. Over beers at a Seward bar, he told me about discoveries that defied basic physics and victims who had died in ways that made no scientific sense. Every spring when the snow melts, we find something that should not exist, Carl said. His voice lowered to avoid being overheard by other patrons. Last year it was a school bus full of kids, perfectly preserved but buried under 40 feet of permafrost in an area that was above sea level when the quake hit. The year before, we found an entire neighborhood intact but upside down, like the tsunami had flipped it and somehow kept everyone inside alive long enough to drown in their own basements. The project that brought me to Alaska was supposed to be routine debris removal in the Resurrection Bay area, clearing twisted metal and concrete that had been revealed by an unusually warm winter. But when I arrived at the coordinates Carl had given me, I found something that challenged my understanding of how natural disasters work. Sitting in a grove of spruce trees 20 miles from the nearest water was a perfectly intact fishing vessel, the Sarah Iceman, according to faded lettering on her stern. The boat was positioned as if it had been gently placed among the trees by careful hands, not hurled there by a massive wave. More disturbing, the vessel showed no signs of damage despite supposedly being carried dozens of miles inland by tsunami forces. The boat's registration numbers matched records from 1964, identifying it as one of 12 vessels that had been in Seward Harbor when the earthquake struck. According to survivor accounts, the Sarah Iceman had been swept away by the first wave and never seen again. The Coast Guard had listed all hands lost at sea with no hope of recovery. I should have radioed Carl before boarding the vessel, but professional curiosity overrode my caution. The boat's deck was slick with a substance that looked like seawater but felt oily and left a residue that stunned my skin. The wheelhouse door stood slightly open, revealing an interior that was filled with the sound of dripping water despite no visible source. Inside the cabin, I found the crew of the Sarah Iceman exactly where they had died 60 years ago. 5 men in rain gear seated around a small table, cards still in their hands from a poker game that had been interrupted by the earthquake. Their bodies were perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decay despite 6 decades of exposure to Alaska's harsh climate. But it was not the preserved corpses that made my blood run cold. It was the expressions on their faces. These men had not died from drowning or trauma from the tsunami impact. They had died from terror, their features frozen in masks of absolute horror as if they had seen something that broke their minds before their bodies gave up. The ship's log, still legible despite water damage, told a story that contradicted everything I knew about the 1964 disaster. According to the final entries, the Sarah Iceman had not been destroyed by the tsunami. It had been carried by the wave into some other place entirely, a realm where the normal rules of death and physics did not apply. March 27, 1964, 6:15 p.m. Wave hit harbor like mountain of black water. Boat lifted impossible height, could see Seward shrinking below us like toy model. This is not natural water. Something else moving in the wave. March 27, 6:30 p.m. Still airborne somehow. Wave carrying us inland, but we are not falling. Water around us full of voices speaking in languages that hurt to hear. Other boats visible, but crews are not moving. Think they might be dead, but still steering. The entries continued for hours after the initial impact, describing a journey through landscapes that did not exist in Alaska. The crew had been carried by supernatural tsunami forces through frozen forests where the trees grew downward from a black sky, across lakes of water that flowed uphill, and past cities of ice inhabited by the victims of previous disasters. March 27th, 11:45 p.m. Lost count of how many dead communities we have passed. Ships from wrecks going back centuries. Buildings from earthquakes that predate white settlement. All of it preserved in ice that never melts. The wave is not destroying. It is collecting. The final entry was written in different handwriting, shaky letters that spelled out words in a mixture of English and what looked like an ancient native language. The translation I found later suggested the crew had encountered something they identified as the Keeper of Disasters, an entity that preserved the victims of natural catastrophes in a realm between life and death. As I read the log, the temperature inside the wheelhouse dropped noticeably. My breath began forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started appearing on the metal surfaces around me. The sound of dripping water increased in tempo, becoming a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I descended into the ship's hold to look for more evidence, but what I found there shattered my understanding of the 1964 disaster completely. The cargo bay was filled with dozens of people, all wearing period clothing from different decades going back over a century. They were arranged in neat rows like passengers waiting for transportation, their eyes closed but their bodies showing no signs of decomposition. Among them I recognized faces from historical photographs of Alaska disasters, victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, miners who had died in cave-ins during the gold rush, passengers from ships that had been lost in storms decades before the Good Friday earthquake. All of them perfectly preserved. All of them waiting for something. At the end of the cargo bay, sitting alone in a chair that faced the others like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra, was a man who looked exactly like my father. He wore the same clothes my dad had been wearing in the last photograph I had of him, taken just before he disappeared during a fishing trip in 1964 when I was 5 years old. But my father had never been to Alaska. He had vanished from a lake in Minnesota, hundreds of miles from any ocean. Yet here he sat among the preserved victims of disasters that spanned over a century of Alaskan history, his eyes closed but his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths that should have been impossible after 60 years. As I approached the figure, his eyes opened and fixed on me with recognition that transcended death. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had been replaced with ice crystals that reflected light like tiny mirrors. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was the sound of breaking glaciers and collapsing buildings combined. The message he conveyed was not in words but in images that flooded my mind directly. I saw the truth about the 1964 earthquake and the disaster entity that had used it to expand its collection of human specimens. Every major catastrophe in Alaska's history had been orchestrated by this force, each one designed to gather specific types of people for purposes I could not comprehend. The tsunami had not been a natural consequence of tectonic shifting. It had been a harvesting tool, carrying selected victims to a preservation facility hidden between dimensions. My father had been taken from Minnesota because the entity needed someone with my specific genetic markers, someone who would eventually be drawn to Alaska to complete a cycle that had been planned for decades. I tried to run from the cargo hold, but the preserved victims began stirring around me. Their eyes opened simultaneously, revealing pupils that had been replaced with swirling miniature galaxies. They rose from their positions with fluid grace, moving to block my escape while maintaining their peaceful expressions. The ship began moving despite being stranded 20 miles from water. I could feel it rising through the trees as if carried by invisible waves, ascending toward a sky that had turned the color of deep ocean water. Through the porthole windows, I watched Alaska's landscape shrink below us as we joined a procession of other vessels carrying their own cargo of preserved disaster victims. We were heading toward a destination that existed outside normal geography, a place where every natural disaster in human history had delivered its harvest to an entity that collected human suffering like specimens in a museum. The 1964 earthquake had been just one note in a symphony of catastrophes orchestrated across centuries. But as we rose higher, I realized something that gave me hope. Unlike the other preserved victims, I was still warm, still breathing normally, still casting a shadow in the supernatural light filling the cargo hold. The entity had made a mistake in its calculations, bringing me here before the transformation process was complete. I focused on memories of the real world, images of my life in Seattle and people who were still alive and waiting for me to return from Alaska. The preserved victims around me began flickering like holograms losing power, their perfect forms revealing glimpses of the decay that should have claimed them decades ago. The ship lurched violently and began descending back toward the forest. Whatever force had been carrying us was losing its grip as I maintained my connection to reality. The disaster entity's collection was dependent on its victims accepting their fate, surrendering their ties to the living world. I crashed through the wheelhouse windows as the Sarah's dream impacted the ground, tumbling into snow that felt shockingly real after the supernatural cold of the cargo hold. Behind me, the vessel was already fading, becoming translucent as it lost cohesion with our dimension. But the preserved figure of my father was still visible in the disappearing ship, still smiling at me with ice crystal teeth. As the vessel vanished completely, I heard his voice one final time, promising that the entity was patient and would wait for me to complete the cycle when my time came. I radioed for immediate extraction and never returned to Alaska, but the Department of Transportation still sends me reports about anomalies discovered in the melting permafrost. Every year they find more evidence of the disaster entity's collection, more victims who should have been lost to natural catastrophes but were instead preserved for unknowable purposes. The 1964 Good Friday earthquake was not the random act of geological forces that history remembers. It was a carefully orchestrated harvesting operation conducted by something that has been manipulating natural disasters throughout human civilization. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of our reality, the tsunami of the dead continues its eternal journey, carrying the preserved victims of every catastrophe toward a destination that exists outside time and space. The ice remembers everything in Alaska, including disasters that were never as natural as they appeared. Story 7. Chulitna Rider. I never believed in the stories until I found the saddle. Let me back up. My name is Marcus. and I spent 15 years as a search and rescue coordinator for the Alaska State Troopers. I pulled bodies from frozen rivers, tracked missing hikers through blizzards, and found what was left of people who thought they could conquer the wilderness alone. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered in the Chulitna River Valley last October. Most people have forgotten about the horse. Back in 1991, a hunter named Bill Kowalski was tracking moose near the Chulitna when he stumbled across something that made no sense. A chestnut mare, fully saddled, wandering through the spruce forest like she was looking for something. Or someone. The horse was calm, well-fed, and clearly domesticated. But there was no rider, no camp, no explanation for how she got there. The troopers launched a massive search. Helicopters, dogs, ground teams. They combed every square mile of that valley for weeks. The horse had fresh shoes, clean tack, and someone had braided her mane recently. Wherever her rider was, they'd gone far. But they never found so much as a boot print. The case file gathered dust for 32 years. Until last fall, when the Petersons went missing. Tom and Sarah Peterson were experienced backcountry riders from Anchorage. Every October, they take their horses deep into the Chulitna for a week-long camping trip. They knew the terrain, had all the right gear, filed proper plans with the rangers. When they didn't return, their daughter called us. I led the search team myself. We found their campsite on day 3, and everything was wrong. The fire pit was cold, but there were fresh ashes. Their tent was zipped shut from the inside, but empty. 2 horses stood nearby, still tied to the picket line, but Tom's mount was missing. That is when I noticed the tracks. Horse hooves leading deeper into the valley. But here is what made my skin crawl. There were 3 sets. Tom's gelding made 1 set, but the other 2 were older, weathered by rain and time. 1 set was normal size, the other was smaller, more delicate. Like a mare, I followed those tracks for 6 miles through terrain that would break most people. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Even my radio started picking up interference, a low humming sound that rose and fell like breathing. The tracks led to a clearing I'd never seen on any map. In the center stood 3 horses. Tom's big gelding, wild-eyed and lathered with sweat. Next to him, a chestnut mare with an ornate saddle that looked decades old. And between them, something that made me question my sanity. The 3rd horse wasn't quite right. Its proportions were off, too tall and narrow, like someone had stretched it. Its coat was the color of old bone, and when it turned to look at me, its eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, black, like looking into deep water at night. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that clearing. But then I saw the saddles. All 3 horses wore tack, but none of them had riders. Tom's saddle was normal, familiar, but the mare's saddle was hand-tooled leather, the kind you see in old Western museums. Initials were carved into the stirrup leather, BK 1991. Bill Kowalski, the hunter who found the original horse. The 3rd saddle was older still, cracked and faded, with symbols carved into the leather that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them, like they were alive. That is when I heard the whistle. 3 short notes, high and clear, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. All 3 horses turned toward the sound, ears pricked forward. The bone-colored horse took a step, then another, and I realized it was walking backward. Not turning around and walking away, backing up, like it was being reeled in by invisible rope. The other horses followed. Tom's gelding fought it, shaking his head and planting his feet, but something was pulling him. The mare went willingly, almost eagerly. As they disappeared into the trees, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Shapes moving in the saddles. Not people, but shadows that suggested human forms. The shadow in Tom's saddle was struggling, trying to break free. The one on the mare sat calmly, resigned, but the thing in the bone horse saddle turned to look at me as they vanished, and I swear it waved. I ran, crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes, my radio squawking with static and voices I couldn't understand. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. The official report listed the Petersons as missing, presumed dead, fell through ice, probably, or got lost in a storm. These things happen in Alaska. The paperwork got filed, the case got closed, and nobody asked too many questions. But I kept digging. The Kowalski name nagged at me, so I tracked down Bill's nephew in Fairbanks. Turns out Bill never came home from that hunting trip in 1991. His truck was found at the trailhead 3 days later, keys still in the ignition. His family assumed he had an accident, maybe a heart attack or bear attack. They found his rifle a mile from the truck, unfired, but they never found Bill. The nephew let me go through Bill's things, and that's where I found the journal. The last entry was dated 2 days before he went missing. The dreams are getting stronger. Every night, I hear horses calling from deep in the valley. Martha thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know what I'm hearing. Something wants me to come back, to find what I lost. Tomorrow, I'm going in alone. If I die, to come back, tell Martha I'm sorry. I started making calls. Old-timers, hunters, guides who worked at Chulitna for decades. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Every 10 to 15 years, someone would go missing in that valley. Always experienced outdoorsmen, always near October, and always there were reports of horses where no horses should be. 1978, Jake Morrison, a trapper, vanished during his fall run. His sled dogs were found 3 days later, huddled together and refusing to go near the valley. 1964, 2 geologists from the university disappeared while surveying mineral rights. Their equipment was found scattered across 5 miles of forest, as if it had been deliberately spread around. 1951, a Park Service ranger named Coleman went missing during a routine patrol. His horse came back to the station 3 days later, riderless but still saddled. The deeper I dug, the further back it went. Native stories from the 1920s about spirit horses that carried away anyone foolish enough to ride with them. Russian fur traders in the 1800s who wrote about phantom riders in the northern valleys. I should have stopped there. Should have transferred to a different district, maybe taken early retirement. But the dreams had started. Every night, I hear them. 3 short whistle notes, high and clear. Sometimes I do wake up standing by my bedroom window, looking north toward the Chulitna. Once, my wife found me in the garage at 3 a.m., loading my truck with camping gear I didn't remember packing. The final straw came last month. I was reviewing cold cases when I found a photograph tucked into the Peterson file. It was a Polaroid, faded with age, showing 3 horses in a forest clearing. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, but I recognized the scene immediately. On the back, someone had written, Chulitna Valley, October 1991. Proof they exist, because Bill Kowalski had been there before. He'd seen the horses, photographed them, and somehow escaped. But something had called him back. I know I should destroy this recording, should forget what I found and let sleeping mysteries lie. But the whistles are getting louder every night, and yesterday I caught myself researching horse trailers online. Whatever's in that valley, it is patient. It can wait years between riders, decades if necessary. But eventually, it calls, and when it does, people answer. I'm fighting it as hard as I can, staying away from the valley, avoiding the backcountry, keeping busy with paperwork and routine cases. But I know it's only temporary. The pull is getting stronger, and sooner or later, I'll give in. When you hear about a search and rescue coordinator who went missing in the Chulitna, remember this story. Don sent teams to look for me. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried, and some riders are meant to stay lost. The horses are calling now. 3 short notes, high and clear. It's time to go. Story 8. Nome Hospital with children. This ward still has toys scattered across the floor. I discovered this 3 weeks ago when I broke into the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Nome, Alaska. My name is David Chen, and I am a medical equipment salvager. Not the most glamorous job, but it pays well. Old hospitals throw away thousands of dollars worth of gear when they close, and most of it still works perfectly. The Nome Regional Hospital shut down in 2011 after the new facility opened downtown. For 12 years, the old building sat empty on the tundra, slowly being reclaimed by the brutal Alaskan elements. The city wanted it demolished, but environmental concerns kept delaying the project. Asbestos, they said, lead paint, the usual bureaucratic nightmare. What they didn't mention was the smell. I first noticed it when I cut through the fence around the perimeter. Even in the freezing October air, with the wind howling off the Bering Sea, There was an underlying odor that made my stomach turn. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. But underneath that, something else. Something that reminded me of the morgue where my father worked when I was a kid. The main entrance was chained shut, but the loading dock in the back had a broken window I could squeeze through. My headlamp cut through the darkness of the service corridor, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The hospital had been closed for over a decade, but the floors were clean. Not just clean, they were wet, like someone had just finished mopping them. I made my way toward the main hospital wing, following the smell that was getting stronger with every step. The hallways were lined with patient rooms, doors hanging open like dead mouths. My light swept across empty beds, abandoned wheelchairs, and IV poles that cast twisted shadows on the peeling walls. But it was the sounds that made me stop walking. Soft at first, barely audible over the wind rattling the windows. A rhythmic beeping, like a heart monitor. Then another one, from a different room. Soon the entire corridor was filled with the electronic symphony of medical equipment that shouldn't to have power, shouldn't to be working, shouldn't to even be there anymore. I checked every room I passed. All empty, all silent when I entered. But as soon as I moved on, the beeping would start again behind me. The elevator was out of order, so I took the stairs to the second floor. The children's ward. That's where I found the toys. Dolls and teddy bears arranged in perfect circles on the linoleum floor of the playroom. Blocks stacked into towers that defied gravity. Crayons scattered across paper with drawings of stick figures holding hands under smiling suns. The artwork was fresh, the crayon wax still soft to the touch. But according to my research, the pediatric wing had been closed since 1998. No children had been treated here in over 20 years. I photographed everything, trying to document what I was seeing before my rational mind could convince me I was hallucinating. That's when I noticed the patient charts hanging on the door frames. Dozens of them, filled out in meticulous handwriting. The dates were all from 1918. Every chart told the same story. Spanish flu, age ranges from 6 months to 15 years. Status, deceased. But the death dates were wrong. According to these records, children were dying yesterday, last week, 3 days ago. The ink was still wet on some of them. I backed out of the playroom and headed for the main stairwell, but the door was locked. Not just stuck, locked from the other side, with a key I didn't have. The only way forward was deeper into the children's ward, toward the intensive care unit. The ICU was a maze of glass-walled rooms, each one containing equipment that shouldn't exist. Ventilators pumped air into empty beds. Heart monitors traced the rhythms of patients who weren't there. IV drips delivered medication to thin air, the clear fluid disappearing before it hit the floor. And in the center of it all, a nurse's station where someone had left a logbook open to today's date. The entries were written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen on the patient charts. Shift notes from nurses who had been dead for over a century, caring for children who had died before my grandfather was born. But the notes described current events. Room 237 needed pain medication. Room 241 was asking for her mother. Room 245 was struggling to breathe. I flipped back through the pages. The entries went back months, years, decades. An unbroken record of care for patients who existed only in the spaces between life and death. That's when I heard the crying. Soft at first, like an infant with a stuffy nose. Then louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from the room directly behind me, but when I turned around, the room was empty. Just a hospital bed with rails raised, blankets pulled up as if someone had just tucked in a small child. The crying stopped the moment I stepped inside, but the mattress was still warm. I ran my hand across the indentation where a small body had been lying just seconds before. The pillow still held the impression of a tiny head. On the nightstand, someone had left a glass of water and a small bottle of medicine with a handwritten label. For Emily Patterson, age 3. To help with the cough. Emily Patterson. I knew that name from somewhere, but couldn't place it. Then I remembered the historical research I'd done before coming here. The hospital had been built on the site of Nome's original medical facility, a 2-room clinic that served the gold rush town in the early 1900s. During the 1918 flu pandemic, that clinic had been overwhelmed with patients. Emily Patterson was the first child to die. The crying started again, but now it was coming from multiple rooms. A chorus of sick children, all calling for help that would never come. I stumbled back toward the stairwell, but the locked door was now wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. The basement was waiting for me. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the building and never come back. But the cries of the children were getting louder, more desperate, and somehow I knew they were trying to tell me something important. The basement was older than the rest of the hospital. Rough stone walls, low ceiling, the kind of foundation they built during the gold rush when Nome was just a collection of tents and wooden shacks. My headlamp revealed a series of small rooms, each one barely big enough for a single bed. This had been the original clinic's isolation ward. The rooms were filled with the same impossible evidence I found upstairs. Fresh linens on century-old beds, medicine bottles with dates from last week, and in the final room, a ledger book that explained everything. The entries were written in a different hand, older and more formal. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the clinic's only physician during the pandemic. His notes painted a picture of overwhelming desperation as more and more children succumbed to the flu. The town was running out of places to bury them. The ground was frozen solid, and the nearest cemetery was 50 miles away. So Dr. Morrison made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He buried the children under the clinic, all 47 of them, laid to rest in unmarked graves beneath the building that was supposed to save them. The hospital that came later was built directly on top of their bones, and for over a century, their spirits had been trapped in the place where they died. But they weren't malevolent. They were just children, scared and alone, waiting for someone to help them find their way home. The final entry in Dr. Morrison's ledger was dated 3 months after the last child died. He wrote about the sounds he heard at night, the voices calling for their mothers, the footsteps in empty hallways. He tried to ignore them at first, but eventually, the guilt became too much. He committed suicide in the basement, in the same room where I now stood reading his confession. I closed the ledger and looked around the small stone chamber. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a wooden crate filled with small personal belongings. Hair ribbons, pocket watches, wooden toys. The final possessions of children who had been forgotten by history. That is when I understood why I had been drawn to this place. It wasn't about salvaging medical equipment. It was about bearing witness to a tragedy that had been buried and forgotten for over a century. I gathered up the belongings and carried them upstairs, past the crying children who grew quieter with each step. In the main lobby, I found what I was looking for, a memorial plaque commemorating the hospital's dedication. At the bottom, in small print, it mentioned the original clinic that had stood on this site. But it said nothing about the children who died here. I left the hospital that night and drove straight to the Nome Historical Society. The next morning, I told them everything I had found. It took 3 weeks of bureaucratic wrangling, but eventually, they agreed to investigate. The excavation began last Tuesday. So far, they found the remains of 18 children, each one buried with care beneath what used to be the clinic's isolation ward. The city has agreed to give them a proper burial in the Nome Cemetery, with headstones bearing their names and the respect they deserved a century ago. The hospital is scheduled for demolition next month, but the memorial will remain. A small park with benches and a playground, dedicated to the memory of the 47 children who died during Nome's darkest winter. I haven't been back to the building since that night, but other people have. Construction workers preparing for the demolition report that the hallways are quiet now, the electronic beeping has stopped, and the children's toys have been put away. Emily Patterson and the others are finally going home. Story 9. Red Snow. I found the first body on my third day tracking the moose. The name is Jake Sullivan, and I've been guiding hunters through the Alaskan wilderness for 22 years. I've seen bear maulings, hypothermia victims, and people who got lost and never made it home. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in that clearing 15 miles northeast of Anchorage. She was half buried in snow that had turned crimson around her body. Young, maybe early 20s, wearing clothes that were all wrong for the backcountry. High heels, a thin dress, no winter gear. Someone had left her there like discarded trash, and the ravens had been at her for days. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fear frozen on her face, and the fact that she'd been running when she died. Her legs were scraped raw, her fingernails broken and bloody. Someone had chased her through the forest until her heart gave out from exhaustion and terror. I radioed the state troopers immediately, but it took them 6 hours to reach my location. By then, I had plenty of time to study the scene, and what I found made my blood run cold. boot prints leading away from the body, size 11 or 12. A man, his prints, following the trail that led deeper into the wilderness. But here is what haunted me. There were other trails nearby. Older ones, partially covered by fresh snow. Someone had been using this area for a long time, and this wasn't their first victim. The troopers treated it as a routine homicide investigation at first. Probably a drug deal gone wrong, they said. Maybe a prostitute who got mixed up with the wrong client. They took photos, collected evidence, and shipped the body back to Anchorage for autopsy. I should have left it at that. Should have guided my client to better hunting grounds and forgotten about the girl in the red snow. But I kept thinking about those other trails, and the growing certainty that whoever did this was still out there. 2 weeks later, I was back in the same area with another hunting party when we found the second body. This one was different, older, maybe 35, wearing outdoor gear that suggested she knew how to survive in the wilderness. But she'd been shot in the back with a high-powered rifle while running through a stand of birch trees. The killer had tracked her for miles before taking the shot, like she was big game instead of a human being. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was hunting women in the Alaskan wilderness, using the vast emptiness of the backcountry as their personal killing ground. The remoteness that made Alaska beautiful also made it perfect for murder. I started paying attention to missing person reports from Anchorage, women who disappeared without a trace, usually from the seedier parts of downtown. Dancers, prostitutes, runaways, people society tended to overlook, whose disappearances didn't generate much media attention or police resources. But I knew where they were ending up. Over the next 6 months, I found 3 more bodies. Each one told the same story. Women who had been taken from the city and brought to remote locations, then released and hunted like animals. Some had been given a head start. Others had been shot immediately. All of them showed signs of prolonged terror. The killer was escalating. The time between murders was getting shorter, and the violence was becoming more elaborate. He was gaining confidence, refining his technique. And I realized with growing horror that I might be the only person who understood the full scope of what was happening. The troopers were treating each death as an isolated incident. Different jurisdictions, different investigators, no communication between cases. They didn't see the pattern because they weren't looking for it. But I was living in the wilderness every day, and I could read the signs they missed. The breakthrough came when I found the airplane. I was tracking a wounded caribou through a valley I had never explored before when I spotted something metallic glinting in the afternoon sun. Hidden in a grove of spruce trees was a small Piper Super Cub, painted in camouflage colors and equipped with oversized tires for wilderness landing. The plane was registered to a man named Robert Hansen, a local baker who ran a small shop in downtown Anchorage. On the surface, he seemed harmless enough. Mid-40s, married with kids, active in community organizations. The kind of guy you'd trust to watch your house while you were on vacation. But his airplane told a different story. The cargo area had been modified with restraints and chains. Dried blood stained the metal floor, and there were scratch marks on the walls where terrified victims had clawed desperately at the smooth surfaces. This wasn't just transportation. It was a mobile prison designed to ferry victims from the city to remote kill sites. I photographed everything and took GPS coordinates before getting out of there. But as I hiked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The forest felt different, more menacing, like I stumbled into territory that belonged to a predator far more dangerous than any bear or wolf. That night, I called a detective friend in Anchorage and shared what I discovered. He was skeptical at first. Hansen was a respected member of the community, after all, but agreed to look into it quietly. What he found confirmed my worst fears. Hansen had been buying supplies that made no sense for a baker. Chains, rope, ammunition for high-powered rifles. He'd been making frequent trips to remote airstrips, always alone, always carrying large duffel bags. And his alibi for several of the murder dates didn't hold up under scrutiny. But building a case would take time, and I was worried about what might happen to other women while the legal system moved at its glacial pace. So I made a decision that still haunts me. I decided to track him myself. I started watching Hansen, this routine, learning his patterns. He'd pick up victims from the red light district, usually late at night when the streets were empty. Then he'd drive them to the airport, load them into his plane, and fly them to predetermined hunting grounds in the wilderness. The next part was the most disturbing. He'd land on a frozen lake or makeshift airstrip, release the women, and give them a head start. Some he'd hunt immediately with his rifle. Others he'd let run for hours, tracking them through the forest like wounded animals before closing in for the kill. He was living out some twisted fantasy, turning the Alaskan wilderness into his personal hunting preserve where the most dangerous game was human beings. I followed him on 3 separate trips, documenting everything from a safe distance. Each time, I watched him land his plane in a different location and disappear into the forest with his rifle. Each time, I found fresh graves when I returned weeks later to search the area. But on the 4th trip, something went wrong. I was watching from a ridge overlooking his latest hunting ground when I realized he wasn't alone. Another man was with him, someone I didn't recognize. They were working together, setting up some kind of elaborate game where multiple victims would be released simultaneously. That is when I saw the women, 5 of them, chained together in the back of Hansen's plane. They ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged, all showing signs of prolonged captivity. Hansen and his partner were planning something bigger than his usual solo hunts. This was going to be a massacre. I had 2 choices. I could hike back to my truck, drive to the nearest phone, and hope the authorities could organize a response in time. Or I could try to intervene directly and risk becoming a victim myself. I chose option 3. I waited until both men disappeared into the forest, then crept down to the plane. The women were barely conscious, drugged and terrified, but I managed to free them from their restraints and get them hidden in the tree line. Then I disabled Hansen's plane by removing critical engine components and destroying his radio. By the time Hansen and his partner returned, I was long gone. But I left them stranded in the wilderness with no way to pursue their escaped victims or call for backup. It bought me enough time to get the women to safety and contact the state troopers with their exact location. The arrest made national headlines. Robert Hansen, the quiet baker who terrorized Alaska for over a decade, finally brought to justice. During his confession, he admitted to killing at least 17 women, though investigators suspected the real number was much higher. But here is what still keeps me awake at night. He mentioned that unnamed partner, the second man who had been helping him with his final hunt. The authorities searched for months, following every lead, interviewing every known associate. They never found him. Hansen died in prison in 2014, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The official investigation was closed, the case marked solved, and Alaska moved on. But I know the truth. The partner is still out there, somewhere in the wilderness, continuing Hansen's work. And every time I guide hunters into the backcountry, every time I find tracks that don't belong or campsites that feel wrong, I remember that there are predators in these forests that are far more dangerous than anything with claws and fangs. The red snow has been covered by fresh storms, but the memory remains. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, I swear I can still hear the echoes of running footsteps and desperate screams carried on the Arctic wind. Story 10. Lights of the Kushtaka. The crying started at 3:17 a.m. And it sounded exactly like my daughter. I woke up in my tent on the shores of Prince William Sound, 30 miles from the nearest village, listening to Emma's voice calling for help through the darkness. The problem was, Emma was safe at home in Seattle with her mother, 1,500 miles away from this godforsaken stretch of Alaskan coast. My name is Michael Torres, and I am a marine biologist studying sea otter populations in the Sound. I've spent 2 months alone at this research station, collecting data and samples from one of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, I preferred it to the noise and chaos of city life. But that night, hearing my 8-year-old daughter, his terrified voice echoing across the water, I realized how completely alone I really was. The crying came from the direction of a shoreline, maybe 100 yards from my camp. Emma's voice, clear as day, sobbing and calling for her daddy to help her. Every parental instinct screamed at me to run toward that sound, to find my little girl and protect her from whatever was making her cry. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and crawled to the edge of my tent, peering through the flap toward the water. The beam of my light revealed nothing but empty beach and driftwood logs. The crying continued for another few minutes, then faded away like wind through the trees. But I knew what I heard. That was Emma's voice, no question about it. The same tone she used when she scraped her knee or had a nightmare. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe the stress of isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The next morning, I found the tracks. They started at the high tide line and led directly toward my campsite. At first glance, they looked human. Bare footprints in the wet sand, about the size a child would make. But when I examined them closer, the proportions were all wrong. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and there were strange marks between the digits that looked almost like webbing. More disturbing was the pattern they made. The tracks didn't follow a straight line from the water to my camp. Instead, they circled my tent 3 times before disappearing into the forest. Whatever had made them had been watching me sleep. I photographed the tracks and uploaded them to the university server, along with a detailed report of the previous night, this incident. My department head, Dr. Sarah Chen, responded within hours. Her message was brief and unsettling. She told me to pack up and leave immediately. No explanation, no discussion of my research timeline. Just a direct order to abandon the project and return to civilization as quickly as possible. When I asked why, her second message contained only 2 words, Kushtaka territory. I had to look up the term online. The Kushtaka, according to Tlingit folklore, was a shape-shifting creature that inhabited the coastal waters of southeast Alaska. Part human, part otter, it could mimic the voices of people you love to lure you into the water. Those who followed the voices were either drowned or transformed into Kushtaka themselves, condemned to spend eternity hunting other victims. Just a legend, I told myself. Ancient superstition from a culture trying to explain the dangers of a hostile environment. But Dr. Chen wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, and her reaction suggested she knew something I didn't. I decided to stay one more night. The crying started again at exactly 3:17 a.m. This time, it wasn't just Emma's voice. I heard my ex-wife Sarah calling my name, then my brother Tom asking for help with something urgent. The voices came from different directions, as if multiple people were scattered around my campsite in distress. But I also heard something else. Underneath the familiar voices, barely audible, was a sound that made my skin crawl. A wet, clicking noise, like someone with a mouth full of water trying to speak. The human voices were just a mask, a deception hiding something alien and predatory. I stayed in my tent this time, but I watched through the mesh window as strange lights began to appear along the shoreline. Blue-green phosphorescence, like bioluminescent algae, but moving with purpose. The lights formed patterns that almost resembled human shapes, dancing and flickering in the darkness. Then I saw the eyes, pairs of them, reflecting my flashlight beam from the tree line. Too high off the ground to be any native animal, but too low to be human. They watched me for hours, never blinking, never moving, just patient, intelligent observation from creatures that had all the time in the world. By morning, the eyes were gone, but the beach was covered with new tracks. Dozens of them, all the same strange shape I'd found before. They surrounded my camp in concentric circles, growing tighter with each ring, until the innermost tracks were less than 10 feet from my tent. Something had been closing in on me all night. I started packing immediately, but the weather had other plans. A storm front moved in from the Gulf of Alaska, bringing 40-foot waves and winds that would make helicopter evacuation impossible. I was trapped for at least another 3 days. That is when I found the journal. It was buried under a pile of driftwood near my research station, wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from the elements. The pages were water-stained and brittle, but still readable. It belonged to a Russian fur trader named Dmitry Volkov, dated 1847. Volkov had been trapped in this same location by winter storms, forced to wait out the season in a makeshift shelter. His early entries were routine observations about weather and wildlife. But as the months passed, his writing became increasingly frantic. He described hearing voices of his family calling from the water, seeing lights that danced like spirits along the shore, and finding tracks that belonged to no earthly creature. According to his journal, the voices became more persistent each night, and the lights grew brighter, more insistent. The final entries were barely legible, written in a shaking hand. Volkov claimed that the creatures were inside his shelter, that they could take any form they wanted, that they were teaching him to breathe underwater. His last coherent sentence was chilling. They say I can join them if I just walk into the sea. The journal ended there, but I found something else buried with it. Human bones, bleached white by more than a century of Alaskan weather. A skull with elongated features that didn't look quite right, and finger bones that were far too long for any normal person. As I studied the remains, I realized with growing horror that I was reading my own future. Volkov had experienced the same phenomena I was witnessing. The voices, the lights, the tracks in the sand. And somehow, those encounters had changed him into something that was no longer human. That night, I made a decision. I would not leave my tent, no matter what I heard or saw. I sealed the zippers, turned off my lights, and waited for dawn. The voices came earlier than usual, starting just after midnight. This time, they were more sophisticated, more convincing. I heard my colleagues from the university discussing my research, my mother calling to check on my safety, even my own voice calling for help from somewhere outside the tent. But I also heard the clicking sounds getting stronger, more pronounced. Whatever was making those voices was losing patience with subtlety. Around 2 a.m., the tent started shaking, not from wind, but from something large moving around the perimeter. I could see shadows passing in front of my flashlight beam, shapes that were almost human but moved wrong, like someone walking on joints that bent the wrong way. Then the voices changed tactics. Instead of calling for help, they started having conversations. I heard Emma talking to her mother about school, my brother discussing weekend plans, my colleagues sharing jokes from the lab. Normal, everyday chatter that made me feel desperately lonely and isolated. But there was something off about the timing, the rhythm of the conversations. Words overlapped in ways that real people wouldn't speak, and responses came too quickly, as if multiple voices were being produced by the same source. At 3:17 a.m., everything stopped. The voices, the movement, the lights on the beach. Complete silence except for the sound of waves against the shore. I thought maybe they'd given up, moved on to easier prey. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, coming from just outside the tent, was talking to someone else. Having a conversation with another version of myself about the research I was conducting, the isolation I was experiencing, the strange phenomena I'd been witnessing. Two versions of Michael Torres were discussing my situation in clinical, detached tones, as if I were a specimen they were studying. And slowly, I realized what was happening. They weren't trying to lure me out anymore. They were learning to become me. I listened in growing horror as my own voice described my habits, my fears, my memories with perfect accuracy. Every detail was correct, from my daughter's favorite bedtime story to the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. They knew everything about me, and they were practicing to take my place. When morning came, the voices stopped, but I knew they'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't need to call for help. They would simply replace me, walk back to civilization wearing my face, and no one would ever know the difference. I am recording this message on my satellite phone while I still can, while I am still me. The helicopter is coming to extract me in 2 hours, but do you know if I'll make it that long? The clicking sounds are getting louder, even in daylight, and I can feel something changing in my mind. If you, re-listening to this, and someone claiming to be Michael Torres shows up at the university or contacts my family, do you trust them? Look for the signs, watch how they move, listen to how they speak, and whatever you do, do you follow any voices calling for help near the water? The Kushtaka are patient hunters. They have all the time in the world to become perfect copies of the people they replace. And once they do, the original person isn't needed anymore. The helicopter is here now. I can hear the rotors approaching across the water, but I can also hear clicking sounds from the pilot's radio, and the voice giving landing instructions sounds almost exactly like mine. I think it might already be too late. Story 11. Phantom ship of the Bering Strait. I saw the ghost ship 3 times before I understood what it wanted from me. The first sighting happened during my second week as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer stationed at Cape Newnham, Alaska. Most guys get transferred to this godforsaken outpost as punishment, but I volunteered. After my divorce, I needed distance from everything familiar. The Bering Strait offered plenty of that. My name is Marcus Chen, and I spent 8 years pulling drowning fishermen from waters so cold they kill you in minutes. I thought I had seen everything these waters could throw at me. I was wrong. The morning of October 13th started like any other. Fog thick as concrete blanketed the strait. Visibility maybe 30 feet on a good day. Our helicopter lifted off at 0600 hours, responding to a mayday call from a crab boat taking on water 40 miles northwest of our station. That is when I first saw her through the helicopter window. A 3-masted schooner emerged from the fog like something from a museum display. Her sails were full despite the dead calm conditions, and she moved through the water with unnatural silence. No engine noise, no wake, No crew visible on deck. The ship looked ancient, her wooden hull weathered to the color of old bone. I tapped my pilot, his shoulder and pointed, but by the time he looked, the fog had swallowed her completely. He shrugged and kept flying toward our rescue coordinates. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Altitude sickness, maybe, or too much coffee and not enough sleep. But the image stuck with me. That night, I researched historical shipping records for the Bering Strait. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1874, a whaling schooner called the Patience disappeared in these same waters. She was carrying a crew of 23 men and a cargo hold full of whale oil worth a fortune. The ship was last seen entering a fog bank near the international date line. No distress signal was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. The official report blamed ice damage and severe weather, but the native Yupik people told different stories. They spoke of a cursed vessel that sailed the fog, crewed by dead men who refused to accept their fate. According to legend, the phantom ship appeared whenever someone was about to die in these waters. I dismissed it as folklore until the second sighting. 3 weeks later, we responded to another emergency. A fishing trawler had lost engine power in heavy seas, drifting dangerously close to Russian waters. The rescue operation was routine until we started our return flight to base. The fog rolled in without warning, thick and unnatural. Within seconds, our visibility dropped to zero. Our instruments went haywire, spinning wildly before cutting out completely. The helicopter shuddered and pitched like something was pulling us downward. That's when I saw her again. The Patience materialized directly beneath us, close enough that I could make out details I wished I hadn't seen. The deck was covered in a thick layer of ice that gleamed like fresh blood in our helicopter's spotlight. Massive harpoons jutted from the ship, its rails at impossible angles, and the rigging was tangled with something that looked like human hair. But it was the crew that made me understand why the Yupik people feared this ship. Figures moved across the deck with jerky, unnatural motions. They wore the rotted remains of 19th century sailing clothes, but their faces were wrong. Sunken eye sockets stared up at our helicopter with desperate hunger. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and seawater poured from their throats like they were drowning from the inside. The ship's captain stood at the helm, one skeletal hand gripping the wheel. His other arm was missing, torn away at the shoulder, leaving exposed ribs that moved with each labored breath he didn't need to take. When he looked up at me, his hollow eyes locked onto mine with terrible recognition. Our helicopter lurched violently to one side. The pilot regained control just as the fog lifted, revealing empty water where the phantom ship had been. Our instruments flickered back to life like nothing had happened. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? Instead, I dove deeper into research, spending my off-duty hours in the base library and local archives. The truth about the Patience was worse than any ghost story. According to a journal recovered from a different whaling ship, the Patience had been cursed from the moment she left port. Her captain, Ezra Blackwood, was known for his cruelty and greed. He pushed his crew beyond human endurance, sailing farther north than any ship before her, chasing a legendary white whale that native hunters warned him never to pursue. The journal described how Blackwood's obsession consumed him. He forced his men to work through blizzards that froze their tears solid. When crew members fell ill, he abandoned them on ice floes rather than waste time on rescue. The ship's doctor wrote that Blackwood seemed possessed by something that spoke to him in the wind. The final entry was dated October 13th, 1874, the same date as my first sighting. By February, I convinced myself the phantom ship was just stress-induced hallucinations. My tour was almost over. 3 more months and I would rotate back to the lower 48, back to a world where dead ships didn't sail through fog banks. Then came the night that changed everything. A brutal storm hit the strait, waves 40 feet high and winds that could tear a man apart. We were grounded until conditions improved, waiting in the operations center for emergency calls that never came. Even the most desperate fishermen knew better than to be on the water that night. I was alone on watch duty when the radio crackled to life. A weak voice came through the static, barely audible over the storm. The caller identified himself as Captain Blackwood of the schooner Patience, requesting immediate assistance. His ship was taking on water, he said. His crew was dying. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, but the voice was so desperate, so human, that I found myself reaching for the radio to respond. That's when I noticed the date on the wall calendar, October 13th. The radio transmission continued for nearly an hour. Blackwood described his situation in growing panic. The white whale had turned on them, he said, ramming their ship with supernatural fury. The hull was breached in multiple places. His men were trapped below deck as icy water rushed in. He begged for rescue, his voice breaking with emotion that sounded genuine. But occasionally, other voices joined the transmission. Crew members screaming about the cold, about the darkness, about something in the water that was pulling them down. I realized with growing horror that I was listening to the final moments of the patients, broadcast across time like a recording that played on an endless loop. The transmission ended abruptly at 03:47 hours. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the ghostly voices had been. I spent the rest of my shift researching the exact time of the patient's disappearance. According to astronomical records, she vanished during a lunar eclipse on October 13, 1874, at precisely 3:47 in the morning. The phantom ship wasn't just a ghost. She was trapped in time, reliving her destruction every year on the anniversary of her sinking. And somehow, the electromagnetic conditions during storms allowed her radio transmissions to bleed through to the present. But why was I the only one hearing them? The answer came to me during my final week in Alaska. I was processing transfer paperwork when I discovered something that made my hands shake. My great-great-grandfather had been a merchant marine in the 1870s. His name was Chen Wei-ming, and according to immigration records, he had sailed on American whaling ships throughout the North Pacific. More research revealed the terrible truth. Chen Wei-ming had been offered a berth on the Patience but declined at the last moment, choosing instead to sail on a different vessel that returned safely to port. The man who took his place died when the phantom ship disappeared into the fog. The Patience had been calling to my family for over a century, trying to collect a debt that should have been paid with my ancestor, his life. My final sighting happened on my last night in Alaska. I was packing my gear when fog began forming outside the barracks, thick and unnatural despite the clear weather forecast. Through my window, I watched the phantom ship materialize in the harbor, her ghostly crew preparing to dock. Captain Blackwood stood at the bow, his hollow eyes fixed on my building. He raised his remaining arm and pointed directly at me. For the first time, I heard his voice without the radio, carried on wind that smelled of death and whale oil. He spoke my great-great-grandfather, his name. I grabbed my gear and ran. Behind me, I could hear footsteps on the dock, the sound of rotted boots squelching through puddles that shouldn't exist. The fog followed me to the airport, reaching through the windows of my departing plane with fingers of ice and regret. I am back in Seattle now, working harbor patrol in Puget Sound. Safe waters, I tell myself. Warm waters where phantom ships dawn, sail. But every October 13th, I watch the weather reports from Alaska. And every year, fishing vessels report strange radio transmissions from the Bering Strait. The Patience is still out there, trapped between life and death, searching for the soul that escaped her over a century ago. She knows where I am. I can feel her in every fog bank, every storm that rolls in from the North Pacific. Someday, she'll find a way to collect what she is owed. And when she does, I'll join Captain Blackwood and his crew in their eternal voyage through the ice and darkness of the Bering Strait. The debt will finally be paid.